Welcome to episode 24 of the Sell My Business podcast. It's both a privilege and a pleasure to welcome Peter Gudmundsson. Peter is the managing director of Longship Partners, a personal investment and management entity. Until recently, Peter was the CEO of the Pet Law Center, a fast-growing leader in pet memorialization and cremation services. Previously, Peter was the president and CEO of RecruitMilitary, the leading veteran hiring solutions company that he bought with an investor group in 2013. RecruitMilitary helps companies attract and retain high-quality veteran employees and students. Peter sold the company for a 34% IRR. Most of Peter's career has been dedicated to leadership in media, education, and intellectual property-intensive businesses. He has purchased and or sold about 30 businesses during his career. Peter is a regular media contributor. He has appeared on CSPAN, multiple local television and radio programs, and has published opinion pieces in Forbes, The Washington Post, U.S. News and World Report, The Hill, The Christian Monitor, and many other periodicals. Peter is also the author of Not Done Yet, a college-to-career transition guide for parents, and the Veteran Hiring Leaders Handbook. He has also served on the board of a 20,000-student charter school system, International Leadership Texas, a former U.S. Marine, field artillery, and intelligence officer. Peter is a graduate of Harvard Business School and Brown University. Peter serves as the honorary counsel for the Republic of Iceland in Texas and is a member of the Young Presidents Organization Gold Maverick chapter. He is married to the former Kathleen Vogt of Bronxville, New York. They reside in Dallas and have 4 adult children. Peter, welcome to the podcast. We're delighted to have you with us, and thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule. Peter, before we start, it'd be terrific to hear your business background and what got you to where you are today.
Well, great. It's my pleasure to be here. I've spent about a 30-year business career running, buying, and selling companies. Coming out of business school in about 1990, I worked in the M&A department at Morgan Stanley in New York. I've worked for KKR's media company. It used to be called K3 Communications. And then throughout, later in my career, buying and selling companies to run, grow, and then sell. Buy, grow, sell is what I call it. So I've been on both sides of the table, both buying and selling. I'd estimate I've probably bought about 20 different companies and sold 10 or 12, sometimes to run them myself, sometimes in a corporate environment where I was working for others who would end up running them.
You know, Peter, that is amazing. At Deep Wealth, we focus exclusively with sellers and on the sell side. And so for the community, here we go. We have someone who's been where we are on the sell side, but also on the buy side. What a treat that is, because when you can understand what the buyer is going through and what their perspective is, it makes your exit even that much more effective. Peter, maybe we can start with that. When you were on the buy side, it'd be interesting to hear from your perspective, what did you see as some of the top mistakes that sellers were making that were to your advantage, that you probably said to yourself, thank you very much, I'll take that, and did what you were supposed to do as a buyer, that perhaps the sellers could have done differently or better to keep the value higher?
Yeah, there are a lot of topics, but the one that comes to mind that I've seen most often that should be avoided is letting ego get in the way. So sometimes a seller will say, this is my business, this is my baby, I built it, it can't run without me. I'm so critical that it can't run without me. And that's the exact opposite of what a buyer wants to hear. I call it buying an ATM machine. You're buying a box that produces cash. And if that box only operates with the one-of-a-kind business owner or seller involved, then it's worth less, frankly. Maybe it's not worth buying at all. In fact, one of the techniques on the buy side is to get the seller to talk about what they do on a daily basis. And you say sort of flattering things like, wow, it sounds like you're pretty critical to the business. And many of them can't resist saying, oh, yeah, I'm critical. All the customers love me personally. And, oh, so if you weren't here, some of those customers might go, oh, well, I didn't say that, necessarily. So ego is the number one thing. The number two thing that sellers need to pay attention to is what is their story? Understanding the narrative of what is the nature of this business, what makes it good, frankly, what makes it not good, or what are its liabilities, but really understanding and being able to articulate why there's value in the business. So no one understands this particular customer like our organization does. Our system is designed for delivering value to those customers, and that's why it's worth a lot, and that's why you should pay a lot when you buy it. And the final big picture item I would mention is organization. Having documents, whether it's corporate documents, accounting records, customer records, tax returns, all those things being in very good shape. It's very common for a multi-million-dollar EBITDA or profit business to have a shoebox full of receipts. And that doesn't build much confidence on behalf of the buyer. Some buyers can extract value if they can get comfortable with those shoddy records. They'll pay less and they'll modernize or professionalize the business and reap the benefits of that. But those are the three major things that come to mind.
Peter, you sound like you've taken deep wealth before. You're covering all those things that we try to preach so diligently to our people, and you've lived it. So excellent points. What kind of buyer have you been when you've been purchasing companies?
I quote Ronald Reagan, trust but verify is the starting point. I believe a much more collaborative approach is important. First, understand the story as presented. That's what I meant on the sell side of understanding your narrative. So really understand that narrative. Why do customers buy? Why do customers not buy? Why is the business successful? In fact, I had a boss years ago in the 90s who said, when you buy a company, take the first 6 months to figure out what they do right. And then the next 6 months to fix what they do wrong. And I think that humility and open-mindedness is very important. Now, having said that, once you think you understand the positive side, now you've got to turn it around and poke holes in it. All right, so what could go wrong? There are various different models or approaches to it. In business school years ago, I was taught by Michael Porter, a 5 forces model, for example, to understand competition and strategy. What is the relative power of vendors or suppliers? What is the relative power of customers? All those types of things. Really understand that systematically. I often use the phrase heart and head. Make sure your head logically understands the business, but every now and then check with your gut, check with your heart. Does this make sense? That's how I approach it.
Peter, before we dive into some of your own experiences with your companies, I'd like to go back to your days in mergers and acquisitions. Advisors may have conflicts of interest with the sellers that the sellers aren't aware of. What would be some of the conflicts that a seller should be aware of when walking into a situation with an investment banker, as an example?
Whether it's an investment banker or a broker, and people often ask, what's the difference? And I say, I think it's about $1 million in EBITDA. If it's below that, it's a broker. If it's above that, it's an investment banker. On the buy side, the buyers will be back time and time again. Or if they're strategic investors and they're rolling up a given space, they're going to be back time and time again. Whereas the seller typically is going to sell, buy a boat, and sail off into the sunset. You do need to be mindful that advisors do have an incentive to make sure that the buy side is happy.
And what we found, one of the things that we talk a lot about in the Deep Wealth experience when it comes to investment bankers, most sellers say, well, listen, I've hired the investment banker. I'm writing a big commission check. I may be paying other advisory fees. If the investment banker has a deal that's worth $100 million or a deal that's worth $140 million, I know the investment banker is going to really push hard for the $140 million deal. Even if it doesn't happen, they're still going to push hard to get it because, wow, that's a lot of money for me and that's a lot of money for the investment banker. So Peter, is that fact or fiction?
I remember the Freakonomics book a few years ago, 10 or 15 years ago, highlighted that with real estate brokers, that a real estate broker typically wants to get the deal done. And if it's $1 million or $950,000, it's true, the commission's a little smaller, but a commission on $950 is better than no commission at all. So there's always going to be a little bit of downward pressure. Those are sort of the negotiating realities, the interpersonal realities. It depends on the size of the business. If the banker is truly expert in the space and can show data, they could say, look, the buyer is offering, I'm making easy numbers, 10 times EBITDA for the business. And that's where businesses trade of this type in your industry. Then it's probably pretty valid. But if it's just sort of smoke and mirrors, hey, it just feels to me like it's more like 8 times. And by the way, multiples are not absolute. They're all relative to the industry and the characteristics of the business. The seller does have to be very much aware of those incentives.
So, Peter, let's talk a little bit about valuation. You were talking about EBITDA and 10 times or 8 times or 15 times. I mean, how hard and fast is that for any particular industry? If I'm in some tech industry and I see other sales going around me that are in the 8 to 9, does that mean I'm stuck there?
It really varies. I mean, all you need is one buyer willing to pay the price that you have and actually follow through to closing. And so cocktail party chatter, it's kind of like buying individual stocks. We all have friends with the cocktail party will let you know that they bought Google at $10 or something. What they never mention is that they also bought American Airlines at that price too, and they lost it all. It's the same way with multiples. I've laughed over the years when you'll overhear or catch later on the buyer and the seller describing the same deal will quote different multiples. A seller should understand how does the buyer approach valuation. There are different methodologies. Is it pro forma EBITDA, meaning what profit will that ATM machine produce when the buyer has bought and integrated it? Understand what that is. Others, it's pure discounted cash flow over 5 or 10 years. Others, it is premiums paid in similar transactions. You have to understand what that comes from. If some sellers are not as sophisticated with finance or accounting, so have your CPA or your accounting firm or investment bank really walk through the different types of methodology. Don't get too wrapped up prevailing multiples because, like I said, people throw that around as sort of bragging rights when sometimes they're not all that precise.
Peter, you have built and become involved in a number of companies which have later sold. And I was curious for your methodology when you're buying a company or starting a company. What is it for you? Is there a particular problem that's fascinating to you that you're looking to solve?
Yeah, for me, I've been drawn primarily, although there are exceptions that prove the rule, to businesses that have some sort of intellectual property, which is a fancy way of saying publishing. I don't like saying publishing anymore because it's been a embattered industry over most of my career. But I like intellectual property rich businesses where there's a body of knowledge being sold in some form, whether it's print, online, video, whatever. And so that appeals to me. Another thing that appeals to me is very well-defined niches or niches, depending where you are in the continent. And that is some little group that can't live without this information or this insight. Those are the types of businesses I like best and where the markets are very well defined. Those are the characteristics of the business. And then in terms of where they are in the life cycle, and this is advice I would have for sellers as well, is where there's still some growth left. Some sellers want to squeeze out every last little bit. And it's really important, especially the niche businesses where they totally dominate the niche. And then the only way they can articulate growth is either through price increases in the product or service, if that's possible, or moving into an allied space, which has all sorts of risks. So it's always good to have a little bit of growth left in your primary story. That gets a buyer excited about how much further they can take it.
I'd be interested to know what you think and what your experiences are in an auction process. As a seller, you probably really like the auction process. As a buyer, maybe not so much. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, you're right. Theoretically, an auction should produce the best value if it's well run. Although I kind of like adding a step before the auction process, which is a preemptive bid. So especially if there's a strategic buyer, you let them know that they're going to get a shot at this. It better be good, because if it's not good, we're going to go out to auction. So the obvious benefits of auction are you getting more voices ascribing value. The downside of an auction is confidentiality of your information. You're sharing your information with more people, which may be a competitive threat in the future. And it's also, you might find yourself with someone who's either unscrupulous or not fully informed, and they may bid the best price up front, but it turns out they're not the best buyer because they whittle it down in due diligence and the negotiation that attends due diligence. And that's really painful when that occurs. And then you have to decide whether you walk from the table and then you're back to the auction and you're kind of wounded at that point. Not irreparably in some situations, but you're going back out to the others, the runners up in the auction process to say, hey, the original winner, turns out they flaked on us. Are you still good at that secondary price that was almost as good? They may be, maybe not. Now they think they have the power. So they may say, no, I'm a little bit lower. You're back to multilateral negotiation, even though you thought the elegance of the auction process would save you.
And it goes back, Peter, to one of the principles that we talk at Deep Wealth, and you're spot on with what you're saying. Firstly, when you're prepared and you done your diligence, your data room is there, you have your team in place, maybe you sell the business, maybe you don't. You always have choices. And whether it's a preemptive bid or whether it's an auction, maybe you don't like either of where it's coming in at. You keep on running the business, and if you've done your job right, that's okay. That's a terrific thing. You're going to have a continued growth. Now, speaking of growth, let's circle back to what you're saying earlier, because one of the things that we stress with sellers is you can't just get into business or into a new segment to make money for the sake of making money. So in your case, you had different passions. You were focused on certain areas that just drove you. Have you been in situations where you just jumped into something for the sake of jumping into something, or has it always been focused on, I like the publishing space, I like the focus markets, I'm just going to stay there, or I'm going to go outside that sandbox?
Yeah, I've been opportunistic as well, and sometimes to good effect, sometimes not. Sometimes it was a Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. If you can't be with the one you love, love the one you're with. And sometimes you can talk yourself into a deal because it's been so long. Again, sellers should be aware of with buyers, especially younger, smaller private equity firms, very often are eager to buy something because their investors did not give them money not to buy things. If you do a thorough research on the potential buyer, that's very valuable information to know. You have to have humility on the way in through due diligence, and also when you come in, to step in on day one and say, all right, step back, you savages. I went to Harvard Business School. I have the answers. That is a recipe for disaster. Every day, come in with a spirit of humility. Apply what you know, but ask good questions and listen to the people on the ground, on the front line. It's always my practice when I take over a company, again, whether I buy it or I work for investors who bought it, is to meet with every single employee and spend an hour with each one. And I mean truck drivers, loading dock people, everybody, because they have the answers. You just have to listen to them. And sort it out and prioritize, of course, because you can't do everything. But I have a very populist approach to running businesses.
I wonder if you could give our listeners from the buy side, particularly there's all kinds of different buyers and what the buyer is looking for. For instance, we know you could be a strategic buyer or a financial buyer, or do they have funds they need to invest? Are they going to have to leverage this? Do they need to borrow money or get cash somehow?
Yeah, there's a lot there to that question, Steve. Number one, understanding your buyer's financing sources is important because generally in a letter of intent, there will be a financing contingency or not. It's just like buying a house or selling a house for that matter, where there is a contingency. And most private equity firms use some level of debt. Debt sounds like a terrible, evil word. No one wants to be in debt. On the other hand, most people buy houses with mortgages. It's essentially mortgaging the purchase of the business. In fact, that's how most things operate. Private equity will almost always have some form of debt. And depending on the reputation of the firm and where they are in their cycle, some of them do overcommit, and that's a problem. If you're truly walking away financially, you may not care. Emotionally, you may still care. I hope you still care about your employees that you're selling with the business. And it's almost a stereotype of 80s excess, or even all the decades since, of private equity firms, the barbarians at the gate and that sort of thing, that overdo debt. And that is a risk. But so it's a risk to closing. It's a risk to your employees moving forward. But it goes back to a point, which is it's very important that sellers know what they're looking for. I know it sounds obvious, but it's not just the biggest price sometimes. Sometimes it's a fit that makes sense for your employees. Maybe a $10 million purchase price from a rapacious buyer who you already dislike from the first meeting is not as good as a $9 million price from a company that feels good, that has values that match yours. Remember, you're going to have to stand in front of your employees and say, hey, by the way, remember I told you we were a family and we were conquering the world? Well, I just sold you. But I feel good about the buyer for these reasons, and you can say that with a straight face because it's true. That's worth $1 million for a lot of people. What's the price of sleeping well on that new boat that you're going to buy?
Peter, speaking of the process, and again, being on both the buy side and the sell side, you have this unique perspective. For many sellers, they'll mistakenly think the LOI, letter of intent, that's the end of the process. Here we go. I got the letter of intent. Terrific. I'm done. Off to the races. So what's that fine line in your experience of how do you get an LOI to a reasonable point for you as a seller?
Yeah, a couple things. One, as a technical point or a procedural point, remember the first one is just the first draft. You can mark it up and send it back. That's perfectly fine. Some people think a letter of intent is like a piece of correspondence between friends that it would be rude to mark it up and send it back. It's not. But it ties back to what's important to you. What are the absolutely non-negotiable key issues? And maybe that's price. Maybe that's the form of price. Some are so eager for a high price and a multiple that they can brag to their friends about that they're willing to take part of it in the form of an earnout or a delayed payment of some sort. Others are, I'd rather a smaller number, but all up front because I just want cash on the barrel and I can walk away. Others want certain treatment of their employees, guarantees, maybe some contracts for some key employees, things like that. So knowing what you really are looking for notionally before it starts, and then once you have your letter of intent, are these key issues there? Don't just think that, all right, for my top 3 vice presidents, I want 1-year severance agreements. Don't think you can just slide that in when you're doing the asset purchase agreement or stock purchase agreement 2 months from now. Get that up front in the letter of intent so there's no confusion later on about that.
So you mentioned earnout. Again, there's probably 2 different perspectives on that, from the buyer's perspective and the seller's perspective. But what have you seen in your experience with the earnouts and their success or failure?
Yeah, nobody likes earnouts. It's one place to start. However, earnouts are a great tool for bridging a gap. So I thought I was selling for $10 million. Now, based on some legitimate due diligence findings, we think it's only worth 8. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll take 8 at closing, but the other 2 will come over 2 years, $1 million a year based on revenue targets or profit targets. That's very elegant. That sounds great. The challenge is papering it over and how do you document that? And then who's really in charge after closing? So again, I'm not given to conspiracy theories. Some sellers think, oh, you'll tank my business on purpose so you won't have to pay the earnout. Yes, that could happen, but it's pretty unlikely because no one wants to tank their business. If you think about the motivations inside of a private equity firm or strategic buyer, no one wants to be the guy that lost the ABC deal, even if it means saving a little bit. In fact, what you should hear from the buyer is, look, I hope you get your earnout. Because if you get your earnout, the business is doing better than we think at this moment, and we're all winners. You get more money, and I'm a hero in my organization because it turns out it was a better deal than we even thought. So try to avoid earnouts if you can, but keep them in your back pocket as a way to bridge the gap that might emerge. And I call it sort of a handful of magic beans. So you got $8 million and a handful of magic beans. Isn't that great if that ends up being something wonderful? But if it's not, you're pretty ungrateful if you think the $8 million wasn't a good start.
Peter, the landscape has changed quite a bit from the buy side. At one point, you had primarily strategic buyers and financial buyers. Recently, you've had family offices that have come onto the scene, which are a hybrid of both. I'm curious from your perspective and for our listeners, where do you see things right now from a buyer's point of view that as sellers, we should begin to understand and appreciate?
Yeah, one thing to think about is, and you mentioned the different types of buyers, to which that I would add search funds. A lot of people haven't heard of search funds, but search funds are what I call micro private equity. It's usually a young man, sometimes a young woman, a year or 2 out of business school. So they're 28, 30 years old. They raise $500,000 from some investors, and they go out looking for one business to buy. Generally, they'll have some private equity sounding name to their firm, Apollo Ventures or something. And then you go to their website and the telltale sign is there's one person or maybe 2 people on the website as managers or the actual executives. And then they name drop a bunch of investors to make it sound like they're backed by a lot of people, which they are. But that's another type of private equity, especially for smaller businesses that you should be mindful of. But I guess that the overall conclusion is there's a lot of money out there. That's the thing that sellers should take heart in. If your business is halfway decent and you can articulate the value, and it is an ATM machine that pumps out cash, there is a buyer out there, more than one. And so, and that's where an advisor, if you choose to use an advisor, should have a very clear sense of the different types of buyers out there. If you have 2 or 3 million in EBITDA, for example, you've got near infinite potentials to sell. There are a lot of people lined up to buy a business like that because they're all looking, again, to my original metaphor, they're looking for an ATM machine that will spit out cash at some sort of a predictable rate. I would say it's a seller's market in the terms of the number of buyers that are out there. As COVID itself is concerned, it ties back to your narrative as the seller. Just really know how that affects you. It'll be in the numbers if it has affected you, but if it really hasn't, then be clear in your narrative on why it hasn't. For example, my last company that I just sold a couple months ago was in the pet cremation business, and we were not affected by the COVID situation, the old joke about death and taxes. And so now it helped that our buyer was strategic, and so that it was a very short conversation because it was more curiosity. Hey, we haven't been affected. Have you? I'm like, no, we haven't either. And so we were very lucky. Again, knowing your story, knowing your facts, making sure it all fits together in a very neat narrative makes you seem more impressive, far more impressive than the ego comments I mentioned at the beginning, which is don't just brag about how important you are, show it in your level of articulation and understanding this business in terms that the buyer can understand.
So what has been your experience from the timeline, the beginning of when you decide you want to sell? How long would that take to prepare? And then once you've got some buyers, how long does it take to get through that whole due diligence process and close?
The flippant answer, Steve, is twice as long as you think. And so, it sounds like a joke, but it's actually true. It takes always longer than you think. There's always something after the holidays, whatever holidays it is, we'll do this or we'll do that. The bankers or brokers always are optimistic because they're trying to cram as many deals into a given year as they can. It's not intentional lying. They're just overly optimistic, and they will set. I've seen 60-day processes, but that's rare. I would say 4 to 6 months. If it's taking much longer than that, unless there is regulatory complexity or other things, there could be something wrong. Make sure you're not being strung along. It is perfectly okay as a seller to say, hey, here's my process. I expect this to be done by 4 months hence or whatever, and then hold the seller's feet to the fire to say, hey, you said you were going to hire a consultant to do a market study. Where are we on that? Because we got to get that done. And don't let them string you out, because sometimes the buyer will use that. And essentially the seller's leverage diminishes with time. For example, if you haven't told your employees, things will leak out. And now you may have a morale problem. As people suspect, why is the boss in there with the door closed a lot talking to lawyers and bankers? There must be something going on. So time is not your friend as a seller. I think it's important to have that conversation up front, maybe even mention it in the letter of intent. We expect due diligence to be finished by this date, a negotiation by this date, and closing on that date. Knowing that it'll slip a little bit, but at least you have the moral high ground that expectations were clear.
Now, you're a very seasoned buyer and seller, but think about this from maybe the first time. To get ready to sell, do you have your management team assembled, or do you really have your financial records in place, and have you begun a data room? You probably do that very quickly, but how long do you think someone really needs to prepare adequately?
It depends how much work that needs to be done. If you're reasonably well organized already, moving to an online data room, I agree, those are very key. In fact, sometimes when I take over a company, I start the online data room on day one. It sounds crazy, but knowing that I'm going to probably be a seller in 3 to 5 years, with that in mind, figure out the structure of your information, not just tax returns and financial statements, but what do we have all of our contracts in one place? Do we have all of our non-disclosure agreements and so on in one place? Do we have a process internally? Whenever somebody signs a customer contract, does a copy go into a certain electronic file? That'll save a lot of time down the road. But there's no real special time. Just don't come to market till you're ready. Don't be rushed. Occasionally there's going to be out of left field buyer that falls in your lap, and then you just have to make it clear, hey, we're not quite there yet on our records. I appreciate the offer, but why don't you come back in 6 months? And then they may say, well, we can deal with bad records. Let's keep going. And you know they're pretty eager at that point. That's a powerful thing. Keep the records very clear, but also tie the information structure back to your narrative, what it is that you think you're selling. And you mentioned also, Steve, about getting your management in place. That may be very important, and usually is when you're dealing with financial buyers. If you're dealing with a strategic buyer that's going to roll in your company and frankly wipe out your senior management, it's less important. In fact, it's good for them not to have to deal with that. Again, understanding as best you can, what is your buyer's plan? And they may not disclose all of it to you, but you can use your own common sense to say, is this a roll in or is this an expansion? So if they're in one state or province and they're going to another, they're probably going to keep most of your people. But if it's 2 factories that make the same thing, one can be shut down and a lot of money saved, that's different.
Peter, some terrific points there. I want to circle back on timing and the ability to make the process go quicker. At Deep Wealth, one of the things that we can't stress enough for the business owners going through the process is that in mergers and acquisitions, the currency isn't money like most people think. The currency is trust. So as a seller, your investment banker has to absolutely trust you, and you must absolutely trust your investment banker, or it's not going to work. And it goes the same way from the seller to the buyer. If the trust isn't there on either side, it's just not going to happen. You might as well move on to find another buyer that trusts you or you trust the other buyer. So I'm wondering from your perspective, again, having been on both sides of the table, as sellers, what can we do to get the trust going quicker than it otherwise would and to build an absolute trust between the buyer and the seller?
I would say that having your story straight, as I've said earlier, is very important. And when I say straight, it means one, it's truthful. Two, it hangs logically. It makes sense. And then in the context of that narrative, you have the data that proves it, whether that's subjective data like customer surveys and that sort of thing, or hard data like actual financial records and contracts. But also being frank about limitations or weaknesses. I think they're going to figure out the weaknesses anyway. If you're upfront about them, but put them in the context of the narrative, it makes sense. Take COVID or pandemics. Most people probably didn't even consider that in their business risk. And I'm sure for the next 20 years, it'll be a section on every single selling document with risks revolving around pandemics. But if you can get out ahead of the likely objections, hey, I know we have a customer concentration risk because 25% of our revenue is with one customer, but here's why that's not an issue. And really explain that. That can go a long way to building that trust. So like I said on the buy side earlier, that I start with a trust but verify mindset. The trust only grows if my verification is working, both logically and in the documents. I'm like, oh, they said this, and it's true. They said this customer would say that. We talked to the customer. They said that. So these people must be on the up and up. And then likewise, when problems emerge, and they always do, at some point during due diligence, they'll say, hey, we lost this customer, but it's not a big deal. Because we're like, oh, yeah, you're probably right. It's probably not a big deal. As the buyer, you're far more forgiving because the trust is high.
I don't want the conversation to end without asking your opinion. We've been asking a lot of questions, but what are the 2 or 3 things that you think are really important for the seller to consider when they're going to make this transaction? I mean, that really stand out for you, and maybe you've touched on them, or maybe there's some new things you'd like to make.
I would say really know what you seek. What are you trying to get from this? And it's usually not something as simple as money. Money is important and what form it takes and what the timing of the payments and all that. But what do you really seek? For example, I'll tell you a frustration on the buy side. I call it crazy old man syndrome. I've been in very many situations where there's typically a 70-something man who is selling his business. And he's not really selling his business. I mean, he's telling his wife that he's selling his business. And unfortunately, you only learn this later in the process. But he's going through the motions in good faith, maybe even in his consciousness, he thinks he's selling the business, but emotionally, he's not ready. If I sell this business, I will die, is literally the psychology. And for a buyer, you can waste a lot of time. At first, the buyer thinks, oh, this is great. This is a motivated seller. He's in his 70s. He wants to retire. This is wonderful. But as you get into it, you look for the warning signs that, no, he just never going to let go. Better to cut and move on to the next deal in those circumstances. And then very often what happens, which is tragic, is you end up with a widow who is selling a business that's not ready, and that's possibly someone's gain on the buy side. Maybe that resonates with some of the listeners. Don't be that guy, is what I put it. Know what you want, and if you embark on selling and you're getting what you want in the deal, I'm not saying to do a deal that's not good for you, follow through on it, or don't walk down that path in the first place.
Peter, you bring up an interesting point, and we'll talk about this, and then I'd like to, in the remaining few minutes, circle back and talk more about you and what you're doing. In some ways, for business owners, talking about exiting is like talking about life insurance. As business owners, we have to think of, we're in the business today, but what's that business going to do for us, for ourselves, for our family, for the legacy that we want to create, and the preparation to be ready to hit that spot on. So back to you, Peter. We've been all over the map of what you've been doing, buyer, seller, mergers and acquisitions. I know the past few years, there's been quite a bit of change going on from 2018 onwards. So what are you up to now that's been keeping you busy these days?
As I mentioned, I just sold a company called the Pet Loss Center to a company out of Ontario called Gateway Services, and they are the leading provider of pet cremation in North America, a strategic buyer. And so I've actually been taking some time off. I was horseback riding across Iceland, where my family's from. I'm actually getting ready to do a 3-week walking pilgrimage to Rome, Italy, starting in the first day of October. After that, and even before I go, I'm networking around trying to find my next either business to buy or a job as a CEO running a mid-size or small business. So that's really a matter of kissing frogs, looking at opportunities. So I'm back in buyer mode. If any of your listeners have a good business that might fit, get in touch with me. Selling is the point of one to many. Buying is one to many in the opposite direction. I've got to meet a lot of people. It's networking with lawyers and accountants and bankers and private equity people. Very often it's taking crumbs from their table in the sense that something that didn't quite fit for some reason, but they can introduce me into the situation. In terms of access to capital, whether it's my own money or there are plenty of private equity firms that would back someone like me for the right opportunity. In fact, they have two limitations. It's quality deals and quality management. And so if I can find the deal, find the acquisition candidate, and if I flatter myself to think that I'm a good manager, then the two things come together.
Congratulations on your recent exit. As you're going to look at companies to either invest in or to buy, what would be the top 3 to 5 factors that are going to have you raise your eyebrows and say, yes, that's the company?
Yeah, I would say it's, again, back to that heart and head thing. So on the head side, the analytical side is something that has at least $500,000, but preferably more in profitability, solid financials, solid growth opportunities. That's number 1. 2, you mentioned it earlier, the trust factor, where there's a good rapport with the seller. I understand the narrative. It intuitively makes sense to me. And then 3, an area where I think I can add value, not just myself, but with my own contacts and the teams that I can bring in of leaders I've worked with in the past, knowing what the path to growth is. And sometimes I really hate the term professionalize because it sounds condescending, and that's not what I mean. But a lot of sellers have a grounded worldview that, hey, I make $1 million a year and life is good. Why should I push it harder? I would come in a little more aggressively. All right, great. You've made $1 million a year. I'll pay you X for that. But I think I can take it to $3 million a year, or $5 million a year. And here's my 4 or 5 year plan to get there. So if I see that sort of a track record in front of me, that's what will get me very excited as well.
Peter, the one question that we ask every guest on the show, and it's a wide-ranging question, is this. It could go to your personal experience, your business experience, or both. Given where you are right now and what got you here, if you could go back to your younger self and tell yourself anything, 1, 2, or 3 things, what would that be?
Trust in the path you're on. So in my case, back in the 90s, I was doing corporate acquisitions for this KKR's media company. And a lot of my peers who did similar functions went into the private equity world as investors. I went on the path of operating businesses. And I do confess that I looked over the hedge to see if the grass is greener a lot over the years to think, man, were the private equity guys smarter than I was to be fighting it out in the trenches of operations? The big advantage of being a private equity person rather than a single manager is your eggs are not all in one basket. I run one company at a time, and so there's additional risk. If I could travel back and counsel myself, say 25 years ago, I would say have confidence, stick with where your skills are, which is a deal-oriented executive. A lot of these pure deal people, they think they can run stuff, but they never really run anything, and they deal in a world of analytical certainty, which actual business management is a part of. But there's also operating or general management is a game of compromise. If you're doing one thing, you're not doing another. And so you have to be comfortable with gray, not ethically, of course, but I mean, in terms of making decisions in a business, you have to emphasize certain things at the cost of something else. Whereas in the elegance of a spreadsheet, private equity people think they can optimize everything, and it's very often not the case. So in other words, long-winded answer, but I would say to trust myself in this grounded approach of being an operator who understands the financial side as opposed to a financial person, pure financial person.
Words to the wise, Peter. And last question for you. If someone would like to find you, what's the best way to reach you?
Probably email is the best. petergud@gmail.com. That's Golf Uniform Delta. petergud@gmail.com. Or LinkedIn, if you can figure out how to spell my name, which is not easy. But Peter Gudmundsson, Gudmundsson. Look for me on LinkedIn in Dallas, and you'll find me.
Terrific. And we'll put all that in the show notes to make it easier for everyone. Well, Peter, this has been a wealth of information from both the buyer side and the seller side and mergers and acquisitions in general. Thank you so much for taking the time out to be with us today.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it.
Thank you, Peter.
Pleasure.